All right, let's go ahead and open in prayer, and we'll go ahead and jump into our lesson this evening. Heavenly Father, thank you for your word, your truth, what you've done for us, and the preservation of your word. Truly amazing how we're able to take information that concerns nearly 3,000 years ago, understand what was written from the prophets of old, to be able to understand your character and truth, so that we will be able to glean who you are better. Help us to understand your word from the perspective of those who wrote it, and from the perspective of those who read it back in those early times. We thank you for the people who are here, and for the people who are watching online, and we pray for those who cannot be here. There's many people within our congregation, as you know, God, that are hurting, that are either in pain and recovery, either a physical illness, a disease, or injury. Help us to be merciful and graceful to all those who are in need, and help them to recover well and to keep an eternal perspective, so as to keep hope and not be distracted by the frustrations, the pains, the afflictions, and the mortality of this life. Help us to love one another, to be the example of love to those who are watching on the side, and to edify one another so as to have confidence and encouragement regardless of circumstance. We thank you, and help us to learn this evening. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, let me do this. Let me come back over here. All right. Well, once again, we're going to be dealing with the history of Israel from about 1000 BC to 537 BC. Now let's go before that. It's like 1040. We in 1 Samuel, we're kind of dealing with a transitional period of time when Saul was king, but really we start picking up the history of Israel under David. A review of 1 Samuel, because now we're going into 2 Samuel. See, I'm not trying to take too much time here. We finished 1 Samuel in 5 lessons. I think the record is 1, but I wasn't trying to break any records. But 1 Samuel, as obviously the namesake of the book, is commissioned as judge, and leads Israel to many years of peace until he is about to retire from being judge, and Israel finds his sons unjust. They're like, you know what, your sons are not too good here. We need to find something as a more permanent solution. We want a king. But instead of petitioning God for the right king and who he wants, the tribes of Israel demand a king of their own design. And God will permit this for now as kind of a placeholder for the true king to come, and an object lesson to Israel, as when you try to select a king based upon what you see on the outward, you're going to fail, period. Saul, though desiring to do what is right, I believe that he had a lot of good intentions. He acts presumptuously, makes silly oaths, and acts as a priest, giving sacrifices, and defies the Lord and not utterly destroying the Amalekites. At the end, Saul was rejected by God as being king, and Samuel grieved over Saul all the rest of his life. Saul was his greatest failure as far as the human concerns. God gave Saul every opportunity, including Samuel, so that he would succeed. And Samuel died before David was actually crowned king. Remember that? Remember Saul, as one of his last things he tried to do was try to conjure up Samuel, which was successful, much to the medium's surprise. And they both said, It's like, I'm not sure if Saul was expecting a response, to be honest with you. I think he was just expecting her to kind of give him advice, since God was not responding to Saul. The Lord instructs Samuel to anoint David, son of Jesse, great-grandson of Boaz, and Ruth in the line of Perez, and Judah, son of Jacob, son of Isaac, son of Abraham. Remember that the lineage is very important going forward, and we have to understand that the eventual Messiah would be a son of David of this line. As David increases in popularity and finds favor amongst the people, and the Holy Spirit is greatly upon him, Saul becomes increasingly jealous and tries to kill David. Now, David at this time is growing exceedingly by many battles and wars, and the most popular and most famous one, the best Sunday school fodder, is obviously David and Goliath, right? Where he does the unthinkable. Everyone else is running away, including his brothers, including Saul, who is heads and shoulders above everyone else, and doesn't even dare go up against Goliath. And David goes out there without spear, without sword, without armor. and takes him down. In the end, Saul and his 3 most prominent sons die in battle. That's the end of 1 Samuel. Saul's reign comes to an end, and David is free to take the throne. But it doesn't mean that all is well. Now, before we actually get into the text, and people are like, okay, so start reading. No. Patience, right? Look at the timeline. We stopped before. We'll skip that for now. When dealing with the actual text, we have to be able to try to actually harmonize 2 Samuel and 1 Chronicles. And when we get to 1 Kings and other portions of 1 Chronicles, and also 2 Chronicles and the rest of 2 Kings. By the way, I titled this particular lesson, David's Difficult Rise to Rule a Unified Israel. And we'll get back to the text in just a moment. But let's go ahead and go over something and the difficulties of harmonizing Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles. Chronicles is written differently, and the accounts are not in 2 Samuel and 1 Chronicles are not always in the same order. That causes confusion when you try to read it and trying to balance them out. The biggest problem people make in dealing with history sometimes is that it's not always in chronological order. And I'll be honest with you, I find 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel more chronological than I do 1 Chronicles, even though it says Chronicles. What we have to do with Chronicles is probably take it more in the lines of Matthew, where it's discourses or events, situations, where the author kind of condenses information in what's happening. He does battles, and he does a whole lot of battles in sequence, rather than simply just timeline of David's life, specifically David. He emphasizes David. We don't really know who wrote Chronicles, but there's definitely a different pattern of writing when it comes down to Chronicles versus Samuel. The reason I'm emphasizing this is because people want to go ahead and read 1 Samuel 1 through 10 and then go think that Chronicles 1 through 10 is going to be doing the same material, and it does not. The authors of Samuel simply give accounts for kind of looking at and kind of writing it down as it happened, showing both the good and the bad of Israel from Saul to David. If you read Chronicles, where does it pick up? It does the biographies or the genealogies of Adam all the way to David, but at the same time, it doesn't really talk about all the bad stuff that happened to Israel. Samuel, for example, is simply just accounts showing both the good and bad of Israel. At the end of 2 Samuel, chapters 21 through 24, which we'll get to eventually, and I'll probably just review it briefly, there's a poetic review of the life of David. And I think it's a really large chiasm, or chiasm, depending upon your pronunciation of the word. The authors of Kings, it's probably the same people, by the way, do the same thing with Solomon and other kings of Israel, and the kings of Israel and Judah as they struggle and eventually fall because of their rebellion and sin. That's basically where 2 Kings leaves off, is northern tribes, Israel, is taken over by Assyria, and the southern tribes are going into captivity into Babylon. Ends in failure. Chronicles was probably written many years later after 2 Kings. Perhaps by Ezra, which been at least 70 years after the events of 2 Kings. Perhaps it was after the return to Jerusalem, maybe even after the events of Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezra decides to write these down. Now, we're assuming it's Ezra because who else is going to write them? To be honest, we have no idea who wrote the books of 1 and 2 Chronicles. And they borrow a lot of information, re-putting things together in a way that makes sense to them or the point that they're trying to make. The author of Chronicles focuses on the history of Israel and emphasizing the Messianic hope with the stable priestly line. So it's Messianic hope and stable priestly line. They emphasize the temple specifically. They talk about who built the temple. They go over the line of the people who actually built the temple. Talk about your boring material. You just go ahead and say, here, this guy and this guy and this guy and this guy, I'll build it. Like, okay, I don't know any of them, and really, personally, don't really care. However, to the people of Israel, this is huge because it continues to establish the line of the priests and to make sure that they understand that the priests were still in high effect during all this time. Chronicles begins with Adam, literally the first word. The first word is Adam. The last words is the decree of Cyrus to return to the land. If you go back into your Old Testament Bibles, if you actually have a Tanakh, a Hebrew Bible, without the New Testament, without the Apocrypha, the last book of the Bible, according to their Bible, is what book? 2 Chronicles. It's not Malachi. It's not Ezra, which is strange because Ezra and Nehemiah have events that are after the decree of Cyrus. Why is that book last? Probably because it's written in kind of like an overview of the history of Israel, and it's that decree, as we learned on Sunday, it is that decree which starts the timeline. Go. And I believe that. I'm kind of unpopular with that one. We were talking about that before. Everyone kind of looks at the 444 BC. I don't think so. I think that the timeline is not necessarily as exact as we would like it to make it. I think they were looking for a period of time after the actual 69 weeks. If you're not knowing what I'm talking about, dealing with the 70-week prophecy of Daniel from Daniel chapter 9. Important study to go back and listen to, especially in light of what we're going to be talking about over the next few weeks in Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles. I wanted to emphasize this idea of what Chronicles does, because if you read Chronicles, you're going to be missing a lot of information, and there's more information added. I found this rather lengthy quote, and I was kind of like, yes, this kind of really nails it. And as far as understanding Chronicles, Chronicles never mentions the Exodus from Egypt. Do you find that odd? Do you think that'd be kind of important? The period of the wandering in the deserts and giving the Torah are also not figured prominently. Kind of mentions them in brief, kind of as a remembrance, not as a historical account. Chronicles also does not focus on the Babylonian exile. Basically, beep, a little tiny paragraph. And then Cyrus says, go back home. All periods when the Israelites did not live in the land of Israel are de-emphasized. Don't you find that odd? If you're going to be given an account of Israel, why is this information not really emphasized? Chronicles very clearly emphasizes the two dynastic political institutions of Judea, the Davidic kingdom and the temple. The Davidic kingdom is the Messiah, the Messianic hope of the Davidic king, and the temple is God is in Jerusalem. God is here. He's with us. It highlights the covenant that God made with David and describes David and his descendants as sitting on the throne of the Lord. 1 Chronicles 29. David and Solomon are idealized, particularly David. And the periods of their reign is described in glorious terms. The story of Solomon's succession highlights this idealization. David is described as announcing to all of Israel that God has chosen Solomon as David's successor. That's kind of how they kind of finish that First Chronicles concept. And this is done by an individual who is a Jewish studies professor at Yeshiva University, not Christian. And they still understand the overall tone of 1st and 2nd Chronicles being that of the Davidic Messianic plan. Now, how they interpret that is completely different, but they see it. And I find that also kind of comforting in the fact that, we're not just out here trying to make things fit. There is that essence there in Chronicles. David is the focal point of 1 Chronicles, and his character and actions are told with little to no negative light. What is the one thing that David is known for? Goliath, and then what? Bathsheba. To be honest, not a whole lot of the other details. Yeah, we understand them, we know them, but David and Bathsheba probably even more prominent than David and Goliath, and some people don't even know it's the same person. David and Bathsheba, that is like, woo, that's a big story, and it's a great story to tell to people. And obviously, I don't know why we tell it in Sunday school. Don't do that. They don't tell this in Chronicles. He is cast as the ideal king and a picture of the Messiah of the future, which said later is a king of David. Messiah, this later king will be a king of David, the perfect David. And so David, they're showing all the highlights of David, going, this is what Messiah is going to be like. Not the bad stuff. You can read about that in Samuel. We're not going to highlight that here. We're going to tell you all the good stuff. In fact, there's additional information about David in Chronicles that really kind of shine the light upon David. After David, the focus is on the temple and of course, and the priesthood. Yeah, it's so important. I said it twice. And the priesthood. After the temple review, Chronicles reviews the kings of Judah, not the kings of Israel. Why? Israel's the northern kingdoms that just basically whoever can kill the other king first wins. The kings of Judah follow the Davidic line. The writer of Chronicles, I don't care who those people think they are. I'm not even going to give them any attention. I'm not even going to mention them. We're going to focus on the Davidic line. Why? They're focusing on that Messianic line, waiting for the king of David. The king like David, the ultimate king, the Messianic king. When we tackle the history of Israel, we may jump around the book a lot. So we're going to go here and there, and honestly, I may not even cover all aspects of the books of Chronicles. Why? Because it doesn't really always advance the narrative to the point that we're trying to make. Now, we'll go over the kings. We'll go over the 20 kings of Judah and the 20 kings of Israel. But we're not always going to sit there and kind of dive into all aspects of the book of Chronicles. We'll probably hit most of it, but not all of it. In the first 10 chapters, for example, I just want to go ahead and show you how this kind of works out, as the harmony works. The first 10 chapters of 2 Samuel, Chronicles quotes or nearly quotes the accounts in several areas. There's sometimes a little bit more information, but almost always it's nearly identical, and very little information is given outside of the actual writings. For example, in 2 Samuel chapter 3, verse 2 through 5, we have the accounting of David's sons, which is repeated in 1 Chronicles 3, 1 through 4, nearly word for word. 2 Samuel chapter 5, 1 through 10 is repeated in 1 Chronicles 11, 1 through 9. 2 Samuel chapter 5, verse 17 is repeated in 1 Samuel 14, 8. Identical. 2 Samuel 6, 1 through 11 is 1 Chronicles 13, 1 through 14. 2 Samuel 6, 12 through 19 is 1 Chronicles 15, 1 through 16, 3. And that, you notice here we have 7 verses, and here we have a chapter and a couple verses. There it kind of jumps from verse 1, it kind of mimics verse 12, and then it kind of skips ahead. It does a whole tremendous amount of extra detail in verses 2 through 25, and then picks up with basically 13 through 19. 2 Samuel 7, we're not going to get to that point yet this evening because we need to spend some time in 2 Samuel chapter 7. Do you know why? Why we're going to spend time in 2 Samuel 7 and 1 Chronicles 17? What is in there? The covenant, the Davidic covenant. It is the highlight of the historical narrative. Basically, when I talk about the historical narrative, I'm not talking about the Torah or even Joshua. I throw Joshua kind of in there with the law a little bit, but if you want to take Joshua with the law, with the historical narrative, from Joshua through Ezra and Nehemiah, this is the point. The Davidic covenant. That's the main idea. Because without the Davidic covenant, the prophecy of Daniel 9 makes no sense. And then obviously the principles of the promised Messiah, we don't even know whose line he's going to be without the Davidic covenant. So we're going to spend some time next week. So we're probably going to go ahead and just deal with these 2 chapters solely next week. 2 Samuel 8 is repeated in 1 Chronicles 18. 2 Samuel 10 is repeated in 1 Chronicles chapter 19. And 2 Samuel 11, verse 1 is repeated in 1 Chronicles 20, verse 1. And that kind of summarizes the highlights. Let's turn over there. Let's turn over to 2 Samuel 11, just to see where this is going. And I'll make this point as well. To me, this is like so interesting how the writer of Chronicles does this. Okay, chapter 11, verse 1 of 2 Samuel says that it happened in the spring, at the time when kings go out to battle, that David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel, and they destroyed the sons of Ammon and besieged Rabbah, but David stayed at Jerusalem. And then what's next in verse 2? David strolling on his roof, looking out over and seeing a woman bathing. Now, turn over to 1 Chronicles chapter 20. It's about that thick in my Bible. Probably less thick in most of yours because I have giant print. I told my wife, if soon I'm going to have to get glasses. I'm breaking down. I know that. And I told her, I said, if I go, I don't want to go there and I don't want to look like a dork. I'm honest. I don't. And so I need her help to get glasses that actually accentuate my positive features. To which he said, so you don't want glasses then? But look at here in 1 Chronicles chapter 20, verse 1. It says, then it happened in spring at the time when kings go out to battle. Does this sound familiar? That Joab led an army and ravaged the land across the sons of Ammon and came and besieged Rabbah, and David stayed in Jerusalem. Now there's some additional information, but David stayed in Jerusalem, and Joab struck Rabbah and overthrew it. What should be next? David and Bathsheba. Not here. Once again, why? Because they're highlighting the good points of David, the ideal David, the Messiah ben David. That's who they're highlighting. And David took the crown off their head, so he brought him back. And so there's no mention of the problem. I find that fascinating. Again, if you're trying to read them in congruence, you're going to go, what happened? And you're going to wonder whether or not the events in Samuel took place. And you're going like, why was this left out? Again, highlighting the positive aspects of David. Okay? So please, when you read it and you try to harmonize the two books, don't let that confuse you. It's always good to pick up a harmony if you want to go ahead and read the actual history and read it for yourself and do some study for yourself. Pick up a harmony. There's some good ones out there. If you do want that, let me know. I know about a good 3 of them. That would be very beneficial. So let me know. Now go back to chapter 1. So 2 Samuel chapter 1 through 4 concern the immediate aftermath of the death of Saul. David learns of the death of Saul from an individual who tells a very striking story. Look at verse 1. Now it came about after the death of Saul, when David had returned from the slaughter of the Amalekites. There, see, I did it. So, like, man, I was so good last week. That David remained 2 days in Ziklag. On the 3rd day, behold, a man came out of the camp from Saul with his clothes torn and dust on his head. Interesting detail. And it came about when he came to David that he fell to the ground and prostrated himself. Then David said to him, from where do you come? And he said, I have escaped from the camp of Israel. David said to him, how did things go? Please tell me. And he said, the people have fled from the battle, and also many of the people have fallen and are dead. And Saul and Jonathan, his son, also are dead. So David said to the young man, how do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan are dead? The young man who told him said, by chance I happened to be on Mount Gilboa, and behold, Saul was leaning on his spear. Do you remember this? Flip back over one page, and Saul was dying. Remember, he's like, he's already been struck by arrows. He's not going to survive this. He asked his armor bearer to kill him. He said he wouldn't do it. He's too afraid. Then Saul basically leaned on his spear and was pierced through. So did he die there? Well, the young man tells a different story. Saul was leaning on a spear, and behold, the chariots and the horsemen pursued him closely. When he looked behind him, he saw me and said, Here I am. And he said to me, Who are you? And I answered, I am an Amalekite. And he said to me, Please stand beside me and kill me, for agony has seized me, because my life still lingers in me. So is he leaning on his spear like a crutch, or is he leaning on his spear like he's trying to pierce him through, and he missed all the major organs, and he kind of is just bleeding to death? So I stood beside him and killed him, because I knew that he could not live after he had fallen. And I took the crown which was on his head and the bracelet which was on his arm, and I brought them here to you, my Lord. Now here's the question: is he lying? I would say probably. I think Saul knew how to kill himself. I don't think there's any issue there. I think that he saw Saul and he's like, hey, I can go ahead and take the crown. I can take all this stuff. I can bring it to David. I can tell him I killed him and get favor from David. Then David took hold of his clothes and tore them, and so did all the men who were with him. They mourned and wept and fasted until evening for Saul and his son Jonathan, for the people of the Lord of the house of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. David said to the young men who were with him, Where are you from? And he answered, I am the son of an alien, an Amalekite. And David said to him, How is it that you are not afraid to stretch out your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed? And David called one of the young men and said, Go, cut him down. So he struck him and he died. David said to him, Your blood is on your head, for your saying, I have killed the Lord's anointed. David took it very seriously. David said, do not let God handle this. Muted now. And allow God to handle it. And I do not myself I don't take my hand. And anybody who kills Saul, David will take vengeance upon that. So therefore, David slew the young man who said he killed Saul. Your own mouth testified against you that you killed the Lord's anointed. Now we may look at that and go, that's strange. Again, foreign time, foreign place, foreign culture, foreign geography, everything's foreign to us. Don't sit there and look at this with judgment. Look at it as what happened. And look at David's passion, even for his enemies. I am sure that many people thought that if I bring news of Saul's death, I'm going to get a reward because this guy's trying to kill David. David didn't look at it that way. The rest of the chapter is David's lament. And you can see that the way that he reacted to the death and the lament itself demonstrated that David truly loved Saul and wanted him to be successful. Even though the Lord anointed David, David did not take it upon himself to take the throne from Saul. He waited for God to give it to him. That is probably one of the biggest character references you can have of any person. That's huge. Chapter 2 contrasts two men, David and Ishbosheth, who was crowned king by Abner. Abner is the commander of Saul's armies, who David taunted in 1 Samuel. So chapter 2 is about Ishbosh, or Eshbaal in Chronicles. Basically his name is Ishbosheth in Samuel, and it's Eshbaal in Chronicles. They basically mean the same thing. It's a different way of writing it. I'm pretty sure that the Chronicles writer was writing a more modern to him form of Hebrew. I believe that's all it is. Sometimes language changes a little bit. It's pronounced almost the exact same way when you come down to it in Hebrew, although they do make the different translation here. Basically, it's a man of sorrow. What the name means. So what happens is that Abner, the commander of Saul's armies, was loyal to Saul. And all of Saul's major sons were now dead. He had this fourth son who was around 40. Why wasn't he at the battle? I have no idea. It doesn't talk about his character. It doesn't talk about him being a coward. It talks about him being taken by Abner and crowned king. David was also taken Actually, he went up to Hebron, and that's where God told him to go. And the people of Judah came and crowned David king, knowing that he was the Lord's anointed. The rest of chapter 2 deal with civil war. That happens in verse 12 to basically the rest of the chapter, in which there's the civil war is pretty fierce. It tells weird stories. I think we'll just go ahead and read the first story. I think it's rather humorous because I don't know exactly what's happening here. So Abner, the son of Ner, went out from Mahanaim, Gibeon, the servants of Ish-bosheth, the son of Saul, and Joab, the sons of Zeruiah, and the servants of David, went out to meet by the pool of Gibeon. And they sat down, one on one side of the pool and the other on the other side of the pool. Then Abner said to Joab, "Now let the young men arise and hold a contest before us." And Joab said, "Let them arise." So they arose and went over by count, 12 for Benjamin and Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, and 12 for the servants of David. Each one of them seized his opponent by the head and thrust his sword at the opponent's side, and they fell down together. So 12 men get in the contest, and they all die. Kind of like a mutual knockout blow. I don't know if they're trying to solve the battle then, but basically it's left undecided. And then battle. Verse 17, the day that battle was very severe, and Abner and the men of Israel were beaten before the servants of David. And now David, now the three sons of, well, let me go ahead and skip around a little bit here. Basically, David was becoming more and more greater in strength, while Saul's line, Ish-bosheth, son of Saul, was diminishing. Chapter 3, during his strength, okay, we have an unusual little statement here about the house of David growing steadily stronger. And then verses 2 through 5 are the sons of David. 6 sons of David by 6 different women. To which we say, what? We're going to mention this at the end. A lot of the same lessons we learned from last week are the same lessons we're going to learn this week. Don't sit there and try to look at this and look at the sins of David and wonder or try to excuse this away. Is this a good thing or a bad thing? Well, we all know that God intends one man, one woman. That's from Genesis chapter 2. We know this. So David's activity is not exactly a good thing. In fact, this comes back to bite him in the butt, honestly. Go ahead and having many children with many different women causes a problem for David. But still, he had many sons. In fact, this is not where it ends. He has many sons after this. But the rest of chapter 3 is about Abner. Abner, serving the son of Saul with dignity, gets accused. Look at verse 7. Now Saul had a concubine whose name was Rizpah, and the daughter of Aiah. And Ishbosheth said to Abner, "Why have you gone into my father's concubine?" And Abner goes, "What?" Look what he's, I mean, again, I don't know exactly how to understand all the Hebrew idioms. Am I a dog's head that belongs to Judah? Today I will show kindness to the house of Saul your father, to his brothers and to his friends, and have not delivered you into the hands of David, and yet today you charge me with a guilt concerning the woman. That probably tells me he did. And number 2, why are you calling me out on this one? After all I've done for you, you're concerned about this? This is what you're concerned about? So Abner tells, keep on forgetting his name. It's not always right there. Ish-bosheth, he tells him, it says, I have what I have sworn to you, I'm going to swear to David. I'm going to transfer the kingdom to him. And Ish-bosheth was afraid of him. So Abner sent messages down to David and said, "Hey, you want this kingdom thing? I can help you out with that." And so Abner makes a deal with David. And Abner brings Michal, Saul's daughter, back to David. It's kind of a strange little story here. When he comes over there and basically takes Michal back, and she was married to. Remember, she was taken from David and given to another. He's out there crying as he's going down the road. He's wailing after her. And Abner goes, go home. And he goes, okay. So again, details, I don't really know why they're always there. But evidently, that was important enough to be included into the what's going on. Now Abner comes to David with Michal. And they have a feast, and David's excited. Hey, you know what? All my enemies are coming to me. This thing is happening. It's good to see like this. And then Abner goes in peace. In fact, let's go ahead and read verse 13. He said, good, I will make a covenant with you, but I demand you one thing, namely, you shall not see my face unless you bring Michal, Saul's daughter, with you and to see me. So David sent messengers to Ishbosheth, Saul's son, saying, give me my wife Michal, to whom I was betrothed, for 100 foreskins of the Philistines. Ishbosheth sent and took her from her husband, and Paltiel, the son of Laish, and he kept on wailing after her, and he said, go and return. So he returned. So that's where it left off. That's why I already mentioned to you. Now Abner, verse 17, had consultation with the elders of Israel. Who are the elders of Israel? That's the not elders of Judah. They're already separate at this point. So you got Benjamin, Ephraim, and all the ones of the north. And said, in times past you were seeking for David to be king over you. Now then, do it. For the Lord has spoken of David, saying, by the hand of my servant David, I will save my people Israel from the hand of the Philistines and from the hand of all their enemies. Basically, Israel's elders, who was speaking for all the tribes of the northern tribes, are turning against Ishbosheth and giving it over to David. So Abner, verse 19, Abner spoke into the hearing of Benjamin, and the additional Abner went to speak in the house of David in Hebron. All seemed good to Israel and to the whole house of Benjamin. Then Abner went, saw David, and David said to him, fantastic. Look at verse 21. Let me arise and go and gather all Israel to my lord the king, that may make a covenant with you, and that you may be king over all that your soul desires. So David sent Abner away, and he went in peace. Now, Joab is the commander of David's armies. Joab does not like Abner. And so when Joab comes back, David tells him what's going on, and he's like, what? You let him go? And so without David's knowledge, Joab sends messengers to chase down Abner, says, come back. So Abner comes back, and Joab kills him. It was unbeknownst to David, and David actually responds very interestingly in verse 26. When Joab came out from David and sent messengers after Abner, they brought him back from the well of Sirah, and David did not know it. So when Abner returned to Hebron, Joab took him aside in the middle of the gate to speak with him privately, and there he struck him in the belly, so that he died on account of the blood of Asahel, his brother, took a blood vengeance. Afterward, David mourns Abner. What does this tell you about David? You see a perpetual character here. David does not like killing his own countrymen, even if they're his enemies. David has no problem killing all the foreign enemies. No issues whatsoever, no mourning. But when one of his enemies falls, people who are responsible for killing even other Israelites, David has a lament. Verse 33, the king chanted a lament for Abner, saying, should Abner die as a fool dies? Your hands were not bound, your feet were not in fetters. As one falls before the wicked, you have fallen. And all the people wept again over him. So David lamented all day and all night. I made a mistake here, so I'm not blaming that one up. I skipped it. You didn't see that. Chapter 4, Ishbosheth is slain. In his bed by unprincipled men, and thinking that they would get favor from David, brought Ishbosheth's head to David, But David has some bad news for them. Look at verse 9. David answered Rechab and Baanah, his brother, sons of Rimmon, and the Betherite, and said to them, As the Lord lives, who has redeemed my life from all distresses? In other words, the Lord's the one who relieves me of my problems, not you. When one told me, saying, Behold, Saul is dead, and thought he was bringing good news, I seized him and killed him in Ziklag, which was the reward I gave him for his news. How much more when wicked men have killed a righteous man in his own house on his bed? Shall I not require his blood from your hand and destroy you from the earth? Then David commanded the young men, and they killed them and cut off their hands and feet and hung them beside the pool of Hebron. But they took the head of Ishbosheth and buried it in the grave of Abner in Hebron. Once again, his enemies treated with respect and care because of David's character. And those individuals who act wickedly against people who are actually in authority, killing people in their bed as they sleep, David sees as a slight to what God desires. And actually, he kills them in retribution. Now, after this comes peace for a time. Now, there's still war, but it's a lot more limited. And David is actually crowned king. Samuel chapter 5, 2 Samuel chapter 5 through 9 is about the nation of Israel under David in its full strength and glory. Chapter 5, verse 1, Then all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, Behold, we are your bone and your flesh. In fact, hold your hand here, turn over to 1 Chronicles chapter 11. 1 Chronicles chapter 11. And I want you to notice something, okay? The Civil War is over. David is crowned king over a unified nation. Now, we have chapter 11, okay? Look previously. You have the genealogies of Saul, the people of Jerusalem in chapter 9 and chapter 10. In chapter 10, the defeat of Saul and the death of his sons, 14 verses. Not a whole lot of history of Israel under Saul. You don't have Saul chasing David all over the place. You don't have all the different warrings of Saul. But it picks up with greater detail in 1 Chronicles chapter 11, verse 1. Then Israel gathered to David at Hebron and said, Behold, we are your bone and your flesh. So here is where Chronicles picks up. Very interesting. Now, the writer of Chronicles really emphasizes David. In chapter 5 of 2 Samuel, he's made king. And so David became king over all of Israel for 30 years and reigned at 30 years old, and he reigned for 40. At verse 5, it says, At Hebron he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months, and in Jerusalem reigned 33 years over all Israel and Judah. Now the king, in verse 6, and his men went to Jerusalem against the Jebusites, the inhabitants of the land, and they said to David, You shall not come in here, but you, the blind and lame, will turn you away, thinking David cannot come in here. They basically thought Jerusalem was too big, too fortified in order to be able to function. However, David simply sees it. He knows where the tunnels are. He knows the city very well. And he captures Jerusalem, calling it the city of David. And he rules from Jerusalem for those 33 years. Interestingly enough, in verse 11, Hiram, the king of Tyre, sent messengers to David with cedar trees and carpenters and stonemasons, and they built a house for David. David is to begin recognized by other kings in the area. Tyre is probably Old Tyre, which is in the northern portion of Israel. It may or may not actually be within the land of Israel, but it is on the ocean. And the king of Tyre actually builds David a house, a nice one, with stonemasons and a nice cedar wood. And it's at this point, look what he says here. And David realized in verse 12 that the Lord has established him as king over Israel, and that he has exalted his kingdom. Why? For the sake of his people, Israel. What does that tell you about David? David's, short story, David's not in it for the money. He's not in it for the fame. He is not in it to self-glorify. He is doing it as God told him to do. He has a passion for Israel. How is that exemplified in the previous chapters? When people kill his enemies who are Israelites, he mourns over them. That's just, to me, that kind of character is not ever seen again. God is going to judge Israel. You realize this? Israel as a nation right now is an obstinate rebellion. God brought them back to the land, but they are still apart from him. And at the end, Israel will be judged by God. Israel will be judged by God so badly that the Gentile nations will come and go, what did these people do to God that he would do this to them? The land will be desolate. That will be right before he comes back and restores all things. But I believe that David has the mental attitude of Messiah when it comes down to his people. Even though they deserve death, and even though they are in acts of rebellion, deserve to be killed themselves, when it happens, he mourns. What does Jesus say about Jerusalem when he's about ready to come over to his own death? And he weeps over Jerusalem, saying, I wanted to just gather you together, but you would not have it. And he weeps over their unbelief. And he's going to be the one who judges them. David has the heart of God. David has the heart of Messiah. He is not the Messiah. He has the heart of him. Chapter 6, David brings the Ark of Testimony from Battle of Judah, also known as Kirath Jearim. Now, this is where the location is. It's it's kind of a far away map. Let me load that up for you. All right, a little closer. So in the northern portions, you have the location where the ark is currently, and he's going to take it on this kind of windy track to get it to Jerusalem. But we have to ask the question, and perhaps you don't remember, why is the ark there? Do you remember? Do you remember when they foolishly brought out the ark? From a location to go ahead and fight against the Philistines, and it was taken by the Philistines. Now, first in Joshua chapter 15, verse 9, it appears as though that is kind of the intended place for it. But let's go ahead and look at 1 Samuel chapter 7. Let's go back over there real quick. After the Philistines return it, after about a period of 7 months, they send it back, and the people found it. And the men of Kirath Jearim came, in chapter 7, verse 1, came and took the ark of the Lord and brought it into the house of Abinadab of the hill, and consecrated Eleazar his son, to keep the ark of the Lord. From that day the ark remained at Kirath Jearim. The time was long, it was about 20 years, and all the house of Israel lamented after the Lord. So they kept it there until David came and got it. And it's one of his first actions he did after becoming king. What does that tell you about David? It tells you that David's first response is, hey, let's not throw a party. Let's go get the ark. However, there's a problem in moving the ark. I don't know what happened exactly. Some further details is later on, but basically they start moving the ark, and somebody doesn't treat it with the actual respect that it's supposed to have, and somebody dies. Look at verse 6. But when they came to the threshing floor of Nachon Uzzah, Uzzah reached out toward the ark of God and took hold of it, basically by the animals, for the oxen nearly upset it. So basically, reaching out, the oxen nearly upset it, and it almost falls, is basically the impression we have here. And he touches the ark, And the anger of the Lord burned against Uzzah, and God struck him down there for his irreverence, and he died there by the ark of God. David became angry because of the Lord's outburst anger of Uzzah, and the place is called Perez Uzzah to this day. So David was afraid of the Lord that day, and he said, how can the ark of the Lord come to me? In other words, if I put this in my presence, I'm going to die. So David was unwilling to move the ark of the Lord into the city of David with him, but David took it aside to the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. David says, I'm not going to risk my life. You risk yours. Nice guy. Thus the ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite 3 months, and the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and all of his household. Now it was told to King David, saying, the Lord has blessed the house of Obed-Edom, and on account of all that belongs to him, on account of the ark of God. So David goes, well, let's go get it then. This isn't an evil thing. It's a good thing. So David goes and gets it, and it's a party. All right. He learns that valuable lesson, but when he goes and gets it from Obed, he brings it in happily. And I mean happily. Look how it's described here. Verse 14, and David was dancing before the Lord with all his might, and David was wearing a linen ephod. So David and all the house of Israel were bringing up the ark of the Lord with shouting and the sound of trumpets. Then it happened as the ark of the Lord came into the city that that Michal, the daughter of Saul, looked out the window and saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, and she despised him in her heart. Now, there's a lot of different ideas about what's happening here. So it's a strange story about David dancing in the skivvies, and we don't exactly know to what extent this is. Now, he said he's reading a linen ephod. Was he just wearing a linen, kind of like an underskirt, so to speak? Some people think he was only wearing a shirt because of the reaction that Michal had. The linen ephod could have been just a shirt. Basically, the story goes, and some people hold to this, that David was dancing nearly naked, where he will be seen in all his glory. And Michal's not too happy about this. And we read it and we go, I don't know exactly what's happening here. All right? But David brings it in. He distributes to the people bread and dates and all kinds of good stuff. In verse 20, when David returned to bless his household, Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out and said, oh, how the king of Israel distinguished himself today. He uncovered himself today in the eyes of his servants' maids, as one of the foolish ones shamelessly uncovers himself. Now, you read that material there. Basically, she's saying you exposed yourself to women. How distinguished of you. So David said to Michal, it was before the Lord, and who chose me above your father and above all his house to appoint me a ruler over the people of the Lord, over Israel. Therefore, I will celebrate before the Lord. I don't necessarily know what's going on here. I don't think I would be doing this. However, I don't know if I've ever been that excited before. Maybe in 1996 when the Cowboys won the Super Bowl, maybe, but probably not that excited. But look what he says to her. I will be more lightly esteemed than this, and will be humble in my own eyes. With the maids of whom you have spoken, with them I will be distinguished. Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no child to the day of her death. I have no idea what that has to do with it. It appears as though it's in retribution that David's like, I'm not going to come near you anymore. You shamed me when I was celebrating. Now, was he naked? Was he not? Was he in his skivvies? Like kind of a skirt type of thing? I don't know. But David was his statement was he's dancing under the Lord. Now, I do use this against people that people say, oh, I dance like David danced. I go, really? You take your clothes off? They don't find that funny. I do. But it's very interesting as to how this was really portrayed in this particular text. What, again, this tells me is that David is more concerned with his mental attitude and his activity towards God than he is about anything else he does before people. Now, we contrast this with the apparent sin of David and the things that he's doing that is not wise, taking many wives, having many children with many wives. But we really should not. Remember the lessons from last week? Now, I just have one mention here about chapter 7, is that's the most important chapter in the narrative, and we'll leave it for next week, obviously. We're out of time now. But some observations. It's a historical narrative. You don't try to take a historical narrative and bring it back into how you should act. It's descriptive, not prescriptive. And the activity of David that is suspect to us is neither condemned nor condoned. We don't look at it and say, wow, David's a real stinker. I think what he did to a couple people, I think is a pretty big stinker on them. I wouldn't do that. But again, different culture, different time, different geography, different rules. I don't know exactly all the different things that David's doing is right or wrong. In fact, even God said in 1 Kings chapter 15, verse 5, that David did what was right in the sight of the Lord and had not turned aside from anything that he commanded him all the days of his life, except in the case of Uriah the Hittite. I got to leave it there and say I don't know exactly how to explain all of these seemingly weird stories about David. What we do is understand the contrast between Saul's line and David's. Even when it comes to Michal, Saul's line. Understand the right actions of David as he respected Saul's line, not taking vengeance for himself, but letting God deal with his enemies. And understand the unrighteous actions of Saul's line and how they did not understand that it was not about them. That's what David got. God blesses David, and David understood this on behalf of Israel. God wanted Israel to succeed. And so therefore, David, who kept the covenant, although he is a sinner, he kept the covenant, which was the Lord is his God, no one else, no idols, no Baal worship. He kept God as his focal point. We'll go ahead and leave it there. I have a few more observations. Perhaps I'll repeat them for next week. But we have to remember, don't try to excuse David's activity. Understand it in history. And allow David to be the person he is and how he respected God and he respected Israel. He loved Israel. He loved God. And he did everything in his power to do what was right in the sight of God, even if we don't always understand it. Any questions about this? Please feel free to ask and we can discuss. Let's pray. God in heaven, thank you for your word. Help us to understand, and as we read, help us to take things as narrative and descriptive and not try to apply these things to our life, but understand who you are as the God of Israel and how you blessed David and how David's line will be blessed forever as you are, Jesus Christ is the Son of David, but Lord. Thank you for that. We praise you as our God. In Jesus' name, amen.